When I first started Dunn DIY, I really didn't know much about working with tools. I knew the general idea of the tools I was using, but I was never quite sure if I was using them to their full capacity. In Tools 101, I'm sharing everything you need to know about tools so you can DIY with confidence. I'm Kirsten Dunn, and this is Dunn DIY. Today we're talking about one of the most basic staples every household should have, a tape measure. As a DIYer, you're probably going to be using them for things like measuring a board to cut, measuring a room in your house or a deck, or measuring a piece of furniture or an appliance to see if it will fit somewhere. Now we're going to talk about the anatomy of the tape measure and some of the terms. The tape is the actual measuring part of the tape measure, and what it retracts into is called the housing. A standard tape measure is broken up into feet, inches, and fractions of an inch. And they can be as precise as 1/16 or 1/32. The metal part at the end of your tape is called a hooked tab. The next piece of anatomy on the tape measure is the lock. Now this tape measure has a sliding lock that you press down while the tape is extended to keep it in place, and then you lift up to release the tape. Now there are other types of locks like this one that stays extended until you press down on the bottom and release the tape. The last piece of anatomy on the tape measure is the belt clip. Now this one is pretty self-explanatory. Almost every tape measure has a belt clip to keep your tape measure close at hand while you're working. Now that we've talked about the anatomy of the tape measure and some of its basic functions, we're going to talk about best practices. Now the first and most important one is always measure twice, cut once. It's super easy to measure at 22¼ instead of 22¾ or at 26 instead of 29 inches. So always measure twice, cut once, because you can't uncut a board. Now when you're retracting the tape measure, it's important to keep an eye on this tab. The tab at the end of your tape measure is what keeps your tape measure precise and accurate, so you don't want it to bend. Hold the tab while releasing the tape to slow down the speed at which the tape retracts. This will not only protect the tab from getting bent, it will also protect your fingers from getting whiplash from the tape. Now another general rule is measure as you go. It's always best to measure, mark, cut, and then measure your next piece. And this is because of kerf. Kerf is just a fancy word for the slit of wood that is removed by the width of the saw blade. Now, it may not look like much, but 1/8 of an inch over 8 cuts suddenly adds up to an entire inch. So this isn't always vitally important, but when you're going for accuracy, always measure as you go. Have you ever noticed the seemingly random measurement on the back of your tape measure? This is actually the width of your tape measure housing, and this can be used for measuring inside lengths. Now, if you're like me, you've probably measured inside lengths like this. And while that's fine, it's not the most accurate. And by using that measurement on the back of the housing, you can simply measure it like this, add on that measurement on the back, and get a very accurate measurement. This last one may seem obvious, especially if you've read the caution signs in all the many different languages at the end of your tape measure. But do not overextend the tape. You can extend it to the last measurement, but if you go past the caution signs, you risk breaking the spring mechanism that retracts the tape, and your tape measure will be broken. There are a few things to consider when buying a tape measure. The two main ones are quality and length. If you're going to be using it for smaller DIY projects, a 12-foot or a 16-foot may be sufficient for you, whereas if you're doing larger backyard projects like building a deck or a fence, you may want to upgrade to a 25 or longer. There are some other features for you to consider for your personal preference when buying a tape measure. Some tape measures have a magnet on the end of the tab. Some also have different facing numbers on the back side. Some tape measures, like this one, have the 1/8 inch marks written out, which makes it a lot harder to confuse 1/4 with 3/4. And lastly, some tape measures have a locking system like this where they stay locked automatically, whereas others have a tab that you move up and down. My recommendation, if you're starting your toolkit, is the Milwaukee 16-foot tape measure. I like this because it's on the smaller side, but it's still big enough for all of my DIY projects. Now, if you're looking to grow your toolkit beyond that first tape measure, I would start looking towards a bigger tape measure, like a 25-foot. This is going to be great for backyard projects like building decks, pergolas, or backyard fences. Ultimately, a tape measure is a fairly simple tool that doesn't need much in terms of frills and accessories. As long as you have a reliable tape measure with clear marks, you're good to measure, then measure again.